All right, so welcome to SPAT Seminar 2, Phase 1, and we are going to begin to talk about Section 2, which is really building the content. First, before we start, I would like to make some clarifications about the first part, our context section, just based on what I have seen from you all come in. And I feel like there's some whole picture clarifications I could make after looking at your products that I hope will help with your revisions. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the implications section. So I think a lot of people didn't understand that where it says on the template implications, and then there's an underline under it, that was a prompt for you to write a section. So you're going to talk about your overall community context, school context, and classroom context. I'll also prompt you to say that not everyone had demographic data, and I think we need to make sure we have some solid demographic data from a good source about your number of free and reduced lunches, about your, which is really indicative of the socioeconomic status of the populations at your school, as far as data on races and students that have disabilities and receive services, things like that, number of students that attend gifted and talented programs. So we didn't have everybody have that demographic data in that top part. Once you finish the top part with your demographics, you'll head into that implications section. So why does this matter for your teaching? You need to really write about it. A lot of you did a really great job of including a section on COVID and how that has changed your context. I mean, having kids on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, and then Tuesdays and Thursdays has a huge implication for your unit and how you're going to teach it with some kind of flow. So I thought that was great. People did a really nice job on COVID implications. Some people even, I'll just back up a minute. When you write this implication section, you need to think about how all of these things are going to impact your teaching and how you're going to react. So I want you to really think about it and write it out. I'm going to give an example. So in your COVID context section, if you talked about that you have kids that are frequently not coming to school right now because of remote learning, who can't get to school, if you have students that don't have access to internet. I mean, I was watching an observation recently, and there were students, there were 3 kids in a van with a guardian or a parent parked outside of a business so they could get internet. And all 3 kids at different grade levels were in their car trying to interact with the teacher on this remote session. Okay, so if you have this kind of context or situation, if you're seeing things like that, that has an implication for how you're going to teach your unit. So I guess what I'm trying to say is make specific ties to the kind of adaptations in your teaching you might make based on what you've learned. That section should be beefy and deep and dig in. Okay, then you're going to talk about your 3 students. So very brief description of the 3 students that you have chosen and selected to have some specific differentiation for needs outside of the core curriculum. And they should all be different. And again, it's totally okay. We talked about this before, but it's totally okay to say student A, I have student A who is a language learner, and I'm going to create these differentiation pieces in my lesson to serve the needs of that student. If you have 2 other language learners in your classroom that might benefit from the same differentiation, I mean, think about it that differentiation will apply to them as well, if that's appropriate. Okay, so it could be that the differentiation you plan for your 3 different students with 3 different needs could apply to a variety of learners in your class. So hopefully that helps. Those were some of the things that I saw that I think I made a lot of comments on. What other questions did you have just about the context section? And you can just unmute and call out your questions. Okay, perhaps it sounds like we're able to, I don't have anything in the chat, so it looks like we're able to move on. If you think of it at the end, we can circle back. Okay, so now that we know who we are teaching, which is the whole purpose of the context section, now let us decide, what are we teaching? We have to know the who before we know the what. Okay, in each of these slides, when I send them to you, you'll be able to actually play a recording from Dr. Hicks. She'll talk to you a little bit about standards and targets. So right now, we're not going to play her video. I'll let you watch it on your own because it's accessible to you. But I'm going to talk about the standards and the learning targets. So this section here should not be unfamiliar to you. It's very aligned with Lesson Plan 3.0 that you've all been using in your professional year. It's just that instead of one standard, you're probably going to have several. Instead of a content area learning target, where before you might have had one learning target for a lesson, you're going to have multiple learning targets across your unit. So content area standards, I just want to be clear because I want to differentiate between a content area standard and a core ELA standard. So let me just differentiate a little bit for you. So a content area standard is going to be your district standard, or you could always go to a national organization for these standards if you don't see them in your school, or you might go to your state standards. They're all listed on the State Department of Education website. Your content standards for your district are often listed on their webpage as well. You'll be able to find a list of the curriculum within the district webpage that states them. These are related to the content you are teaching. So if you are teaching social studies, you will have social studies standards. If you're teaching health, you'll have health standards. If you're teaching math, this is where your math standards go. If you're teaching writing, a unit on writing, this is where your writing standards go. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. You include the number of the standard with it, and you actually just copy and paste the actual standard from the source. Okay. If you're unfamiliar with where to get these standards, I would ask your mentor teacher to help you locate it, or your liaison to help you locate them. You should know where to get them. I mean, it's going to be important when you're a teacher in a classroom. So if this is something you're still uncomfortable with, please ask so we can help you and show you where these come from. Because teachers don't just decide what they're going to teach all by themselves. They have to meet district and state standards. So this is where they're getting these from. Okay. We're going to take those content area standards and we're going to turn them into very specific, measurable learning targets. There will probably be several learning targets for each standard. I would caution you against having too many content area standards. So this is a unit that you're going to teach in somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks. Some people stretch it into 4. I don't recommend that. I think 2 to 3 weeks is a good period of time for teaching your unit because it generally takes longer than you think it's going to. So if you start pulling every single content area standard that you think is related to this, you'll never get it taught. Okay, you want to narrow it down and be specific. I'll give you one hint when it comes to teaching mathematics. So our district units in math generally are longer than you're going to teach. So sometimes, and Rich can chime in here, but they're generally about 4 weeks as I understand it. And for a student teacher that's teaching that unit, it may stretch into 5 or 6 weeks, depending on your context and depending on your students. So my recommendation is always to bite off a chunk of that unit. So maybe take it and break it in half. Okay, so that's just a recommendation. So try to narrow in on your standards and make it doable for yourself. We're going to spend a great deal of time talking today about how to go from a content area standard to a content area learning target. We'll talk about that later. Right now, I want to talk about the difference between these two things. And what you see here is our ELA standards and ELA learning targets. So no matter what you're teaching, it does not matter. You are always going to have students enter into this learning process by either reading, writing, speaking, or listening. So these are going to be some supporting standards that you're going to be able to integrate into your unit while you're teaching. For example, if you are teaching a unit on social studies, I'll just use that as an example, okay? And you are teaching, for example, a unit on the Civil War, my guess would be that you're going to have the students read about the Civil War in some way, shape, or form. So if you, and I'm just going to make this up, but if you have students reading a textbook and they're engaging in a textbook, you could integrate an English language arts lesson here by teaching kids about what they might see in a textbook. So they might use some reading strategies that you teach for during reading that might have something like how important headings are. So you might teach the importance of headings in a textbook. And that might be something you identify as a standard. Or main idea, you might identify something like that. You could have students collaborating with each other. So maybe there's some speaking standards. Maybe they're going to do a presentation where students would be speaking and other students would be listening. So again, here's where you could find some accompanying standards. Again, please don't put 100 standards here. Maybe pick 3 to 5 really important things that you're going to have them do. Some of this right now may be for the ELA standards, some of this may be kind of drafty in some ways, because after you plan all your instructional strategies, you might circle back up here and do some drafting. This part is a little bit recursive. Okay, because you're kind of, I mean, right now you probably might know based on your content. Yes, they'll do some reading. It's going to be nonfiction. And so I probably could teach this type of lesson here. I'm teaching a writing unit here, but I am going to have kids brainstorm their ideas with each other. So I might choose a speaking standard. Okay, I wouldn't go beyond like 4 or 5 things here. Again, we'll turn those standards into targets, and we'll talk more about that.
Sherry, I have a question.
Yes.
I am doing a writing. I'm integrating science and writing for my SPAT, and on the Boise School District curriculum thing, they said that the writing standard is an ELA standard, and so. Yeah. I was just going to put the science standards in the content area, and then I put the writing standards in my ELA, but should I put those up in with the content?
You know, you're going to, in a case like something like that, that's very integrated, let's talk about the content as science. Okay, kind of like we did in our Writing Across the Curriculum project in 345. It would look a lot like that if you took the 345 class, where you picked a content area, which was science or something like that. And then the writing goes in the ELA. You could, yeah. You want them to do both. You want them to achieve the writing standards, and you also want them to achieve the content area information that you want. Okay. If you're doing a reading unit, it's going to be a similar thing. You would have reading up here. What else will kids do to support that reading? Okay, down here, what other skills? And it may be that you're teaching some grammar or some spelling, and you'll find those in the language arts standards. Okay, so you'll have to break them apart. Okay, so let's talk about how we get from a standard to a target. Those of you who took 430 last semester, this should look extremely familiar. And now you should say, oh, that's why Sherry and Angel were teaching that, because it was going to be part of our SPAT. So one way to go from a standard to a target is to first identify those verbs that you see in the standard. So in this particular standard, I just pulled one out of the air. Okay, this was an ELA standard, but I'm looking here at the verbs in the standard, and I see determine, and I see the word respond, and I see the word reflect, and I see the word summarize. Okay, so those words in the standard probably each dictate a learning target. Okay, one of my targets probably is going to be I can determine. Another one, I can respond. Another one, I can reflect. And another one, I can summarize. So one way to find those targets hiding in your standard is to look at the verbs. You don't have to teach every single one of these in your unit. It may not be applicable to you, or you may want to focus in on particular ones, but you could see how I can now see what it is the kids need to do, right? I also need to look at the nouns closely because I need to know do what. So if determine is one of our verbs, I have to ask myself, I can determine what. And the what is here, the theme of a story, drama, or poem. Now for my particular unit, I have to know which one it is I'm focusing on. I don't have to say, I can determine the theme of a story, drama, or poem. I know what I'm going to use. So maybe we're going to be looking at a poem in this particular place. So I would say, I can determine the theme of a poem. And maybe you're going to teach a particular type of poem. Okay, maybe you're looking at some kind of Cinquain poetry or something, or maybe if it's a drama, I could determine the theme of Romeo and Juliet. Like maybe you even know the story. That's where you get really specific with what you're teaching. Okay, maybe it's a story from your basal reader. I can determine the theme of what is the story. Get real specific here. Okay, and somehow this slide got a little bit jumbled. I will fix it up for you. But I think that first part will give you an idea about how we are going to be really specific with our target, yet they're still tied back to the standards. And liaisons, this is what you're going to look at when you are looking at your candidates' SPATs. Can I tie the target back to the standard? Does it make sense? Did they just randomly pull them out of the air? Okay. So one way to make sure that you are tied to your standard is to create a chart for yourself. Okay. If the verb is determined, the noun is a theme, how can I create a learning target out of that? So sometimes I'll just create a whole table of my standards and then look at which ones we're really going to hit hard. Okay. All right. Now I have to think about, and you'll notice on our template, when it talks about the learning targets, you see this little text in there that says knowledge, skill. And for some students, this part's really hard to figure out. Is my learning target I just wrote, is it a knowledge target or is it a skill target? And I'm going to contend there's actually 4 types of targets. And we talked about those last year in your internship. There's knowledge targets, reasoning targets, skill targets, and product targets. Okay, so in that section that says knowledge and skills, you actually could divide your targets into 4 categories. Okay, these are definitely knowledge targets. I'm asking kids to just learn and recall some information. Okay. Maybe they're going to understand, identify, know. It's at the very beginning of our learning. A reasoning target would call for you to be up in the higher depth of knowledge categories. It would be high up in the higher, excuse me, it would be up in the higher critical thinking areas. Okay, and then here you see some examples of some skill targets that you want kids to do. Okay, and then product targets are going to be you want them to actually show you. They actually have to demonstrate it. Okay, skills and products, sometimes we can link them together if you want to, if it makes more sense for what you're doing. And sometimes people, oh, I'm sorry, there you go. Sometimes people lump the knowledge and reasoning together. And that's why you just see in our SPAT template, they're only calling for knowledge and skills. So whichever helps you, I think for me, it helps me to kind of look at all 4, but if you'd like to break it just into 2, you can. And the reason I like the 4 particularly is because then it's going to allow you to match the assessment to the type of target you have. It's also going to help you link the instructional strategy to the target. Because if I have a knowledge target, my instructional strategy is going to be focused on building students' knowledge, helping them to get the building blocks. Okay, not produce a product yet. So I think it helps with linking your assessment to your target.
Sherry, may I ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely, anytime. You guys just jump in with your questions.
So it says the knowledge and skills for the content area learning targets. So I guess I have 2 questions. Will we also address the knowledge and skills in the ELA learning target section as well?
You don't really need to divide those up and be so specific about them, but you do need to have it in your brain.
Okay, so
you do need to think about it when I'm teaching these accompanying strategies. Okay. For somebody like Julia, who's actually like almost dividing the importance of each of these areas, she probably should break them into the different parts.
Okay, and so then when so like focusing on the content area learning targets, when we write those we put those targets in that space, are we putting our targets in and then explicitly writing down what knowledge and skills targets are that learning targets addressing? Does that make sense?
I would make 4 categories. So right now you have 2. When you look in that part of the template, it has a heading of knowledge and it has a heading of skills.
Right.
So just include them under the heading.
Okay, so put the learning targets under the specific headings. Got it.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Yeah, really great question.
Sherry, question about the SPAT in general.
All right, somebody needs to mute.
I think it's Kaylee.
We don't know who it is.
I just saw her like box.
Okay.
But
Okay. All right. Also, we need to think about the depth of knowledge that our target is at. Okay, so if it's a knowledge target, what should be the level of the depth of knowledge you're teaching at? Okay, usually it's recall and reproduction. So if you're teaching a knowledge standard, you're usually going to keep your questioning at kind of like a who, what, where, how. Okay, Patty, is that you? No, it's not Patty. Who is it? Okay.
It's Kaylee.
Kaylee. Okay, thank you. All right. So, and you want to balance your lessons too. Like it's almost like you're working up to that more critical thinking area sometimes. It's like first I'm going to give my students the building blocks of knowledge at that depth of knowledge of maybe one. And then maybe we're going to move into some application, and then we're going to get to some strategic thinking and or some creating or some showing. So you need to think about your targets in that way too. Am I building those building blocks first? And then how do I build on that to get up into more strategic and critical thinking and creativity? All right. So I am going to suggest that for you, that you create a chart like this, where you put in those verbs from the standard, the noun, you identify the type of standard that would be or learning target. And you think about the depth of knowledge. And I think when you do that, it's really going to help you with your planning. And it's also going to really help you think about later when you're choosing those instructional strategies. I think it's going to help you tie the appropriate ones to the standards. It's not something you have to turn in, but when we go to answer the questions and do the narratives for the assessment section, having this information is going to really help you to answer the questions. And you might at some point even drop some of these tables into your explanation. Okay. Language targets are a very difficult part of your unit. And here's what I'm going to say. Until you get to the instructional strategies, you honestly cannot create your language targets. This is actually like in a backward design model. We have to wait until we see the instructional strategies you're going to use to fully understand the language demands. So for now, what I'm going to say about language targets is, okay, let's wait. We'll wait until we have more ideas about your instructional strategies. And then together in one of these seminars, we're going to go ahead and break them into language demands. And I'm going to show you again how to do the targets. So that's okay to leave this part blank for now. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. I'll come back to this in just a second. All right, let's go. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's talk about what's coming up for those of you who would like to work a little bit ahead in the assessment planning. So you're going to need to make a plan to measure the prerequisite. Two things. You have to think about what prerequisite knowledge do my students need to be successful in this unit, and where are you going to get that from? So I'll use math here as an example. So if you're about to go into a math unit on double-digit addition, what prerequisite skill do your students need to have? So somebody can unmute and try to guess some things students will need to do if you're going to teach a unit on double-digit addition.
Place
You
value.
know how to add just single digits together.
Single digits, they have to have a very good sense about place value. What else? Okay, so I would also say, yes, they have to know how to add, but maybe that they have some strategies for adding too. Like what is automatized for them in addition, and what is still like they still need strategies for, so that you have a good sense. But if kids don't have that prerequisite knowledge, they're not going to be successful in your unit, and you're going to have to plan to somehow scaffold that. So there are ways for you to really find that out. You could look at mathematical, like you could look at their some benchmark assessments that you have done. You could look at the scores from some recent units Maybe you've done some observation with students, but you have to have a way to kind of check out that prerequisite knowledge. The other thing that you're going to need to think about is you're going to have to build an assessment plan. So you need a before or a pre-test of the knowledge you are about to teach. You could potentially put some of that prerequisite knowledge in, but then it won't give you a good measurement on the after test or the post test. So you're going to need a pre-test. You're going to need a formative assessment plan during the teaching that will guide your instruction, and you're going to need a post test. Your pre and your post test have to be directly comparable. Okay, so it's not like you can do a KWL before you start and then give some kind of performance assessment at the end. You have to be able to compare the score on the pre-test with the post-test. So these are some things to keep in your mind. You're going to have to define success. So you're going to have to decide on a scale, what is it going to look like for students to be successful in this unit on my different learning targets? So it's almost like if you think about a rubric for your learning targets, what would it look like for a student to have basic skills or proficient skills, or really not own the skill at all? So we'll go through and we will take part in some activities to help you determine that criteria for success. And then overall on your post-assessment, what is going to be the final score that says students have done enough to demonstrate that they can pass from this unit to the next? Like, I have done enough to demonstrate my proficiency for you. And we'll talk about that skill as well. And then how are you going to progress monitor students in this unit? Again, with that formative assessment, how are you going to know which students are ready for that summative assessment and which are not, and some that need pre-teaching? And how are you going to progress monitor your 3 students very carefully and closely throughout this unit? So the skills that we're going to be talking about as we go through, as you're starting to think about your units and how they're developing, this is where we will jump in next time. And I probably will send you the video before we meet. That's my plan, but we will see how that pans out.